Our speakers today will be providing important information to help us make our decisions when we vote on the 12 proposed Florida constitutional amendments. Jim Malles and Karen Seggerman, who by the way are married to each other, will share the current status of each amendment and what a yes or no vote really means. Both Karen and Jim have contributed so much to the community. Instead of detailing their careers, I will summarize only some key accomplishments. Their careers are similar and dedicated to what I'm calling community building and leadership. Both have bachelor's and master's degrees and are certified in their fields. Public affairs for Jim, urban and regional planning for Karen. Both worked 30 plus years in their chosen fields. Jim worked for Polk County, then Verizon, and other companies involved with building and managing cell phone towers. Karen was a transportation and land use planner. Currently, Jim owns two companies, Wireless Planning Services and Wiley and Malles, a commercial real estate firm. Karen has her own business, specializing in myofacial release and yoga. They are and have been very involved in our community in so many ways, including Jim being City Commissioner, President of the Kiwanis Club, and President of Historic Lakeland Incorporated, Karen being President of the Lake Morton Neighborhood Association and on the Board for Arts in the Park. There are many more things I could list, but instead, please join me in welcoming Karen Seggerman and Jim Malles.
Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and to speak about a very important topic, the amendments to the Florida Constitution that have been proposed. We're going to do this a couple of ways. I'm going to present on the first couple of the amendments that were done by the legislature and by the public, and then Karen's going to take you through what the commission proposed that changes to the Constitution. On your table, there are a couple of things. There's a list of the amendments, both in Spanish and in English. So if you have friends who are Spanish and can use that, please take one. There's information about the half-cent sales tax for schools and something very close to the League of Women Voters, which is Amendment 4 regarding the restoration of voting rights for felons. So we'll jump right into it. And we'll try to get through this. We have about 53 slides, so we'll work very hard to do this. First off, the commercial we have to give is the League of Women Voters is a non-partisan political nonprofit organization. It was established in the 1920s when the women got the right to vote. They really screwed up in 1972 and allowed men in, much like Kiwanis and Rotary. I know it was about the 70s that let women into the Kiwanis clubs. They serve the voters and promote good governance. They do research, advocate, and educate these things. Well, membership's open to anybody who wants to be a member as long as they're 16 years of age. We don't have that problem in this room since the kids left. So. On the ballot, and I'm not going to read all of this, but you'll see that it's going to be a very full ballot for Polk County and the state of Florida. But the big one we're going to be talking about is the 12 constitutional amendments. There are three sources of amendments that I touched on very briefly, that we're going to be talking about. The legislature can put things on the ballot with a 3/5 vote, and they've chosen to do that in a couple of places. Citizens can garner signatures on petitions representing 8% of the people that voted in the last presidential election, and we have several of those on the ballot this year. And then once again, the Constitutional Revision Commission put 12 on, I think, although the courts have done some damage to that group. Let's jump right in. Let's get to the fun one. And I'm not sure why I got chosen to lead the charge on these, but we'll try to walk you through it. The first amendment put on by the Florida legislature was a change that would give us our third $25,000 exemption on real property, homestead properties and real property. And the limits here is that the property needs to be worth at least $125,000. That will up the total homestead exemption to $75,000 for a house if it's worth more than $125,000. The issue for a lot of people on this, and they've done actually a nice job of providing this for us, is what does a yes vote mean? A yes vote means likely that the city and the state, or the city and the counties will have less money to run the government on. Marcia Fox, and I have the whole document up here, has figured out that Lakeland would lose about $950,000 in ad valorem tax revenue if this passes, and Polk County would lose almost $9 million of ad valorem revenue if this passes. So yes vote is going to be very important with the loss of revenue, and no vote would retain the current exemptions as they exist. And you have a choice if you wish. If you have questions, we can try to answer them as we go forward. We also have a list on the screen of those organizations that oppose this amendment and who support it. And we try to give that wherever we can get it. It's interesting that the legislature passed this, but nobody's really come out of the woodwork to support this amendment. Amendment number 2. Whoops. Yeah. And once again, if you happen to live in Bartow or Winter Haven, I do have a list up here that'll show how much money each of those, Marcia has calculated each of those would lose if this passes. I didn't have enough to put on your table. Amendment 2 is an interesting one. Currently, there is a legislative amendment or legislative act that caps non-residential and non-homesteaded assessments at 10%, and that cap expires in a couple of years, and this amendment would make that 10% cap permanent. And so the vote yes would keep the 10% cap and disallow revenue from rising. What happens now is, let's say you have a condo at the beach and the value of it skyrocketed. Currently, that cap is 10% change, so that's what they're taxing at that point. A no would end the tax limits on non-homestead properties and possibly increase taxes as those properties increase in value. The Florida Association of Realtors is a supporting organization, and opposing is the Women League of Voters. Amendment 3, it was a citizen initiative, and this one's very interesting to me. It's voter control of gambling in Florida. For those of you who've watched the legislature take in billions of dollars from gambling and spend it, this might be of interest to you. There's a legislative agenda, or not a legislative, sorry, it was a citizen initiative. So they went out and got signatures on 8% of the voters who voted in the past election. And a yes vote would require that voters approve any new gambling casinos in the state of Florida. A no vote would keep this current system in place, which allows the legislature and the governor and the cabinet to approve new casinos in the state of Florida. So this would put a lot of power to the voters to approve future casinos in the state of Florida. You know, I don't know if it's good or bad if you're a gambler. Amendment 4 is the one that the League of Women Voters has been very involved in. Oh, let's go back one. I do think it's interesting to see who's supporting this organization. The voters in charge, Disney Worldwide, the Seminole Tribe of Florida, of course they control gambling in Florida in a lot of ways, No Casinos Inc., and at this point there's no opposing organizations. The Voting Restoration Amendment. And there is a handout on your tables which gives some more explanation about this. But this is a citizen initiative amendment that would restore the eligibility to vote to peoples with a conviction, felony convictions that have completed their sentences. And that includes any restoration they have to pay, or any probation that they're on. And there's an exclusion cut out for sex offenders and for murder, people convicted of murder. This is a big issue nationwide. Florida has about the toughest, one of the 4 toughest ways for felons to get their voting rights restored. And once again, this is a citizen initiative. Just a couple of points about this. In 2011, newly elected Governor Scott, with the consent of the cabinet, issued strict new rules resulting in only 3,000 restored rights, even though there are about 30,000 pending applications. So only 10% of the applications that have been submitted over the last couple of years have been acted on. And there are about 1.6 million Floridians who can't vote because of this amendment. And here is Amendment 4, the folks supporting it and the folks opposing it. Amendment 5 was provided by the Florida legislature, and so the Amendment 5 is interesting because it imposes a supermajority vote by the legislature for the increase in any taxes and fees at the legislative level. I'm a little fast on the fingers here. A vote yes would require 2/3 of the Senate and House votes on a supermajority to raise any taxes or fees. A no vote leaves it the way it is currently, where the legislature can pass whatever they want. That doesn't require supermajority, just a majority. And Amendment 5 supporting, Florida Tax Watch, and then opposing. And I will say that a lot of these that the League of Women Voters oppose is based on the fact that they're very supportive of home rule, that their government is to the people. They think that's in general a better way. So that's some of the reasons why they oppose these. And with that, I will turn it over to Karen, who will take you through the amendments that were presented by the Constitutional Revision Commission. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So amendments 6, actually through 13, I don't know why it says 11 there. Well, 6 through 11 are ones that have multiple things in them. So if the legislature proposed an amendment or the citizens bring one forward, it has to be one topic only. The Constitutional Revision Committee didn't follow that. So we're going to go through a number of amendments here that have disparate items on them. And so you'll have to be looking at, you might like one but not like the other. So, think about that when you're voting. If you really don't like something, you might not want to vote for that amendment even though you like part of it. So the first one is called Rights of Crime Victims and Judges. So this one expands victims' rights, many of which are already in state law. Eliminates existing constitutional provision that the victim's rights do not interfere with the constitutional rights of the accused. Noting that in the part with the victims law, this is an extension of what's called Marcy's Law that was created in California, where a young woman was murdered by her ex-boyfriend, and then when he was released on bail, her family was not notified that he was released. So they put a law in place that would require that the victims or their family be notified if something happens with that person who perpetrated the crime. So this would extend that law to Florida. The next one raises the retirement age of judges from 70 to 75. This does not impact those who are on the bench at this time, but people who would be elected to the bench in the future. And our next one is about what a vote yes would do. So it would add more victims' rights to the state constitution, and many of them are already currently in state law, but not in the Constitution. It would dramatically increase protection from disclosure of victims' information, so your victim information couldn't be shared. It would allow more victim input and access to pre-sentencing investigations, sentencing or pre-trial release proceedings, and sentencing reports. So all that information that you might want to know as a victim. And it also sets deadlines to complete any state appeals by a prisoner. So 2 years for a non-capital case and 5 years for a capital case with some limited exceptions. And finally, the proposed amendment eliminates an existing constitutional provision that ensures victims' rights do not interfere with the constitutional rights of the accused. So there's a statement in the Constitution that would be removed. So finally, we also look at raising the mandatory requirement ages for the judges, and would force judges to decide if the state agency correctly interprets the law. So right now, judges just go by whatever the state agency interpretation was. So a yes vote would let the judge decide if that was the way to go. And so your no vote would, of course, not apply to all of those things. So you see there's a big mix inside of that one amendment. Who's supporting that amendment? So 24 Florida sheriffs, there's 66 sheriffs in Florida, and 24 of them are supporting this. And Florida Smart Justice. Opposing organizations include the ACLU and the League of Women Voters. Next, we have Amendment 7. Covers a variety of things regarding first responders, militaries, and colleges and universities. Just mishmash of those. So this amendment creates mandatory death benefits to surviving spouses of first responders and military members. This often creates some duplicate benefits. It requires a supermajority vote to raise or impose college or university fees, which obviously would have the effect of limiting money for universities, and establishes the state college system as a constitutional entity. Right now, universities are a constitutional entity. This would add colleges to that structure. So a yes vote, it does go flying by, doesn't it? There we go. A yes vote would require a supermajority vote of the University Board of Trustees, which that would be 9 votes, and the State Board of Governors to increase fees, the college fees. It would make the governing framework for state colleges part of the Constitution. It would create a constitutional requirement for state and local governments to pay death benefits to first responders. So those who employ those first responders would be required to make that payment. And it also expands the definition of first responders to include paramedics and emergency medical technicians. So this might be quite a burden on local governments who employ these individuals. And finally, it requires the state to provide death benefits to members of the U.S. military who are either residents of Florida or who are stationed in the state. So that would come out of Florida's general fund. So of course, no funding sources are identified for that. A no vote would, of course, exclude all of those things. Who's supporting this? The Association of Florida Colleges is supporting it. Opposing is the Florida Education Association and the League of Women Voters. Amendment 8 has been removed from the ballot by court order. This was amendment in regard to school board term limits and duties and also public schools. It was the Supreme Court removed this ballot initiative on September 7th. They stated it was misleading to voters by not clearly stating its true purpose, and that it did not mention charter schools by name, because it deals a lot with some things that happen to charter schools, and it didn't actually use the word charter school in there. So we can just skip on through that. Amendment 9 prohibits offshore oil and gas drilling and restricts vaping in closed indoor spaces. So a yes vote would ban offshore drilling in waters under state control. It would not apply to federal waters and would not affect any shipping of gas and oil on Florida waters. And this would also add new restrictions to the Constitution on the use of electronic vaping devices, largely mirroring current constitutional restrictions on indoor workplace smoking. So, and a vote no, of course, would not control oil drilling or vaping. And who's supporting that? There's a list of people supporting both, supporting and opposing. So, supporting is Florida Wildlife Federation, the Gulf Restoration Network, American Cancer Association, Cancer Action Network, League of Women Voters, Florida Policy Institute, and Progress Florida. Opposing includes Florida Petroleum Council, Associated Industries of Florida, Florida Chamber of Commerce, and Consumers for Smoke-Free Alternatives. So there's kind of a wide range depending on where you fall on those subjects. Amendment 10, state and local government structure and operation. So this one, the Constitution currently stipulates that on odd number years, each session must start in March, but it leaves the legislature to pick when they start their session in even number years. So this particular amendment would require the legislature in even years to start their sessions in January. The state law currently designates the Florida Department of Law Enforcement as our terrorism combater, you know. So this particular amendment would create an Office of Domestic Security and Counterterrorism. So it would require a whole new department under the FDLE. The third thing, the Constitution already authorizes the Department of Veteran Affairs. This would make it mandatory. And finally, the Constitution requires that all of these offices exist in each county that are listed there. They're referred to as constitutional offices. And this measure would mandate election of those offices. Right now, Florida's counties are divided into charter counties and non-charter counties. The charter counties are voter-approved documents. Those charters are approved by the voters, and they establish how the government will be run. In this case, if this amendment passes, even those charter counties who decided not to have these offices would be required to have them. There are 20 charter counties. So the yes vote would require those things we discussed, fix that date for legislative sessions, establish an Office of Domestic Security and Counterterrorism, and force the permanent establishment of Department of Veteran Affairs, and force all Florida counties to hold elections for constitutional officers. So, and a no vote would, of course, not require those things. Supporting organizations, none, and opposing, just the league. Amendment 11, and this is the last one that's all mixed up in a bundle. So this one repeals the state's ability to prohibit non-citizens from buying and owning and selling property. This is based on the alien land laws that were approved in 1926. They're in the book still, they're in the Constitution, but they cannot be enforced. There's not a way to enforce them, so they just kind of sit there. It also deletes a provision that forces the state to prosecute criminal suspects under a law they were charged under, even if the law is repealed. So if you got arrested for something, you're sitting in jail waiting for your trial, and then the law happens to be repealed, they'll let you go. And then in regard to the high-speed rail language, in 2000, the voters approved the amendment, and 4 years later, the voters will return that amendment, but it was never removed from the Constitution, so this would require it to be removed. So 3 topics there for you. A yes vote would repeal the legislature's right to restrict property rights of non-citizens, delete requirement to prosecute criminal suspects for laws that have been changed since the crime was committed, and delete the high-speed rail language. And a vote no would do the opposite on all those. Who's after this one? This is kind of hanging there. There's 3 issues there, and you want to look at those very closely. So the next one, Amendment 12. We're in the home stretch here, just 2 more. Expands restrictions on paid lobbying by former public officers. So right now, they can not lobby. Former public officials cannot lobby for 2 years. This would expand that time frame to 6 years before they could lobby the state government. The second one is expands the range of government agencies so that a sitting legislature may not lobby to include only state government, not only state government, but federal and local governments. The new prohibition would include statewide officers such as cabinet members. So this would create a great restriction on lobbying. And then also includes the new prohibition against office holders and public employees using their positions to gain a disproportionate benefit for themselves or their families. So a vote yes would meet each one of those things we just discussed, and a vote no would keep the 2-year ban in place and not speak on the other issues. Okay. One thing to note is there has been little enforcement of the 2-year ban on lobbying, so a 6-year ban may not get much enforcement either. Who is supporting this? Integrity Florida, Common Cause, and Florida Policy Institute, and there's no one opposing this at this time. Finally, Amendment 13 ends dog racing. So, I guess this one is, it says on my notes here that the court has ruled against this proposal and it's being dropped. I'm not convinced of that. It wasn't in some other things I read, so I'm just going to follow through on this. That a vote on yes would ban all dog racing as of December 31st, 2020, and a vote no would continue to allow wagering on dog races. And supporting this, this is just, taking care of animals. These are kind of an animal rights issue by Grade 2, K, USA, and League of Women Voters, and then the Florida Greyhound Association is opposing that. So those are all the amendments. I want to reiterate one point that Jim made earlier in regard to the bulk promise for the half-cent sales tax. That is on the ballot again at this point in time. So it first was put in place in 2003 to support schools, and you can see by the little wheel there, the pie chart, what the money has gone for. But I want to list you some of the things that really it's done to make you think about it. It's replaced acres of roofs, ancient buses, broken chillers, like refrigerators in kitchens, lead pipes, bought computers and other technology, and enabled the system to repair damage from hurricanes in 2004 and from Irma last year. So think closely about that half-cent, renewing that half-cent sales tax. I also, see, they're going to talk about it right there. They added that on. So a vote for that school tax question would vote for that tax to continue improvements for the schools and be effective in January and continue for 15 years. So it's obviously been in place for 15 years. And a vote no would discontinue it completely. What is this? Loss of $1 million, okay. I don't know about this one. The Polk County Efficiency Commission. They added to our thing with it. County charter amendment, so we can't address those because we don't know about them. So we can't help you today with these things, but you can go to supervisor elections, you help with voter registration, and it is National Registered to Vote Day, so if you're not registered, join the bandwagon. There are 3 ways to vote in Florida: by mail, vote early, or at your precinct on election day. So you can just call to get added to the vote by mail or to vote early. And be ready to vote. League of Women Voters site has a lot of information on these amendments, and there are other websites out there that carry that information as well if you want to know more information. Okay.